So at this point, we have a lot of the elements in Space Fighter starting to come together nicely. Let's go ahead and spend a little while working on a weapons system. Now, Logan and I have spent a lot of nights sitting around the table designing and redesigning weapon systems for Space Fighter. We wanted to make sure that we created a system that was extremely flexible and easily extended. And I believe that the final result is quite nice. Now, what kind of flexibility will there be? Well, quite a bit, actually. First of all, any weapon that we can create can be used by an enemy or can be used by a player. Of course, keep in mind, with the focus of the Space Fighter engine, as far as video content is concerned, we're primarily going to be focusing on the creation of weapons for players. Though with an enemy, you can still go in and plug a particular weapon into an enemy, then he can make use of it. And we'll demonstrate that a little bit later on. We wanted to make sure that the weapon system went above and beyond what one might expect to find in a 101 course, which would be a simple ship that, something like this, a single ship that's firing out some plasma balls. And we're going to set that up, obviously, but we wanted the ability to come in and do things like, here's, actually, that looked really rough. Here's some sidearms on the side of this guy that can fire out some sort of heat-sinking missiles that will then go around seeking the targets to destroy. And if we wanted to chain even more weapons onto our ship, we can. And the same for enemies. We wanted the system to be flexible enough that we could go about giving enemies sidearms, etc. Again, that's something we're not going to focus on in the creation of the Space Fighter engine here, though keep in mind the flexibility is in place. So how would we go about creating such a system, yet keep it very easy to work with? Well, what Logan and I did, for starters, was break it down. Take the word weapon system and break it down into some components. And we came up with 3 components that worked out quite nicely. So let's go ahead and scroll on down and talk about these components. First thing, visual. Even in the drawing that I just created a second ago, we saw that we had some sidearms that had attached to our ship. Visual aspect of it is, hey, there's some weapons that have attached themselves to our ship that we can fire some sort of cool missiles out of. Those are cool missiles, just trust me on that. Now, visual is obviously important, but as far as a true weapon system is concerned, visual is not a key element. What is a key element? Well, generally, but not in every case, a weapon's going to fire a projectile. So projectile ended up becoming one of the 3 components. Okay, so in this particular case, that would be a projectile. Also, a plasma bullet being fired out of the end of our ship is a projectile. But an interesting thing to point out in this particular case, we don't have a visual weapon. It's almost as if the ship itself was the weapon in which we're discharging these plasma balls from. That's why a second ago I said visual. It's not a key element in regards to the weapon system, but it does play a role.
Well, not only that, we're looking at each of these subcategories as something we would like to be able to accomplish, but not be required of the weapon system. We would like to be able to have things that are essentially visual weapons in the future, but we don't want the system to require that we have a visual item in case we would like to apply our weapon system directly to the main ship.
That's right. So the final thing that the weapon needs, and this we need it in pretty much every case, and that is some sort of timing and direction, where direction can be optional, but there's always timing. As simple as a single shot, be it something that damaged every enemy on the screen or the launch of a single projectile plasma ball. We need some sort of timing and direction system. So we'll just put it down as timing and direction. So with these components written down, Logan and I then began discussing, all right, well, how do we tie this into our system so that we can keep everything decoupled from one another? We're not forced in a position where anything is required. That's really interesting. I mean, at the end, well, no, nothing's required, actually, to be honest with you. Thinking about how flexible this system is, we don't have to have a visual component. We don't necessarily have to have a projectile, and we don't have to have a timing and a direction. There's a way we can tie directly into functionality.
Now, I will point out that there are 3 base classes that make all of this work, and those do generally tie together fairly directly. Now, the idea is that each of those base classes are simple enough where they don't, in and of themselves, lock you down in almost any way.
Well, none of these. Well, looking at this, none of these are required.
Basically, your fire and timing, or your timing and direction system, can be turned on and off.
Right.
Your projectile system is just, it's really just a trigger.
Yeah.
And the visual system is just dependent on what the weapon is attached to.
There you go. But again, keep in mind, none of these are required, and that'll make a lot more sense in just a few minutes. But having that sort of flexibility in there, see, Logan likes to call this a trigger. I like to think of the projectile as just a little bit of functionality, and that functionality can be anything that you can imagine. And because of that, it could be a trigger that spawns off a single projectile, or it could be something completely different, very radical. And having that flexibility in this weapon system will allow you guys to create, once again, anything that you can conjure up with your imagination. So how did we end up breaking all of this down? Well, for starters, let's go ahead and focus solely on projectile and timing direction. You'll see how visual will play its role in just a few minutes. So as far as projectiles are concerned, if we were to scroll back up, you have already seen a mock-up of it here in our layout of classes where we have projectile, and from projectile we've got bullets and missiles. But we don't see weapon anywhere. So where exactly is weapon at? Weapon is going to be a class that is going to stand on its own, and weapon is simply going to be the description of how a projectile or functionality will occur. Okay? So we could start out by saying we have a gun. That's a gun, I promise you. That is our weapon. But if you take the visual aspect away from it, this particular gun has a trigger, and when fired there is a projectile. So here's a projectile that has been loaded into the gun, and that projectile is fired out. Now here is a more complex machine gun type thing. Just trust me on that. This guy's timing is going to be an automatic fire when that same trigger is held in. So if you hold the trigger in right here, single shot. Hold the trigger down here, rapid fire. And again, let your imagination run wild. You may have a weapon that, if fired, is going to start shooting guys out in all sorts of directions. Well, think of some type of grenade or something. Once again, his timing mechanism is once we have been activated, let's hold X amount of seconds, and then so here's what that weapon looks like. And then let's send off our projectiles, our shards of metal, in every different direction. So in this particular case, since we know that visual is a component all unto itself in the weapon system, if you were to take the pictures of these different weapons away, what are we left with? We're just left with a weapon that describes the timing and serves as a trigger for firing off the projectile or whatever sort of functionality we would like to discharge. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to call our timing and direction, we're going to call that our weapon. So with that in place, actually, if you guys don't mind, let me take just a second. Let me erase this out and put weapon up there, because that will begin to make the picture much more clear. Just keep in mind that when I'm talking about a weapon now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about timing, and I'm talking about direction. Okay? So where would that fit into our hierarchy of classes at the moment? Well, nowhere. It's going to stand off on its own. So we're going to have a class. I'll just draw it somewhere over here. That is a weapon. It's going to be an abstract class. The class itself will have a little bit of definition in place, but it is set as abstract because we do not want to instantiate a weapon.
As a matter of fact, internally we'll actually be leaving out one of the key points of linkage to make the functionality actually work. So the code that is put in place is for defaults and values on fields and for some default functionality when firing. What will be left out of weapon is the actual linkage between what you had drawn as the trigger press and the idea of something actually happening. The idea is that weapon is meant to be extended into a class which describes how a trigger press affects firing.
Precisely. Now, while you were talking, I went ahead and extended weapon, So here we have extended weapon into 3 very specific weapon types. And I'm just calling them single, auto, and burst. Where single will simply act as a weapon. So here's the weapon, and it's just a single shot. When you hit and hold fire, you get a single shot of it. That's all. Where
you can think of it as a semi-automatic type weapon.
Yes, you can tap fire over and over and over and over, but you get one shot.
Yeah, exactly. The linkage there is one actual firing per trigger press.
Mm-hmm. With automatic, you hold the fire button in, and we have an automatic distribution of continuous. So it's like hitting fire, 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 fire over and over and over and over.
But the idea is that for one press of fire, you can get any number of projectiles. As a matter of fact, an undetermined number until you release the fire button. Then we stop firing.
And with burst, let's say that it is set up in such a way that our burst total is 3 projectiles. So if I hit the fire button one time and hold it, we have a burst of 3 projectiles coming out. In this example weapon that I'm putting together, we're going to create stuff like this as we work our way through the weapon system. But here we've seen 3 different ones. If I wanted to add one more, just again to demonstrate, I could have a wave, because we will be looking at creating some wave weapons, where with the wave weapon, we could end up with some sort of pattern like this of projectiles being shot out. So once again, the idea of weapon is the definition of our timing as well as direction for projectiles. Though direction is optional in the sense that it may not be a projectile that is being fired off. It's going to serve as a triggering mechanism that we'll get around to for the firing off of a projectile or the firing off of some sort of specified functionality. Because if it's some sort of invisible sonic pulse that wounds everyone, well, you're not going to see a projectile. Or if it's a trace hit weapon or something like that, you're not going to see a projectile come out. But we have the ability for that to be the functionality that is triggered by the weapon. And like I said, in all cases, timing is important, because even a single shot, what is the timing? A single shot of that functionality. Where in auto, it's a repeat of it over and over and over. So weapon system, he's off all by himself. So we have projectiles in place. We have a weapon system. I do believe now it is time for us to begin a graphic that begins to illustrate how all of this is tied together. So let's go ahead and jump over to the whiteboard and bring up a new sheet. And let's go ahead and hide out some of these sheets right here. There we go. And I shall begin by first creating a ship. Now this can be any ship, but let's think of it for a minute, if you guys don't mind, as a player ship. The player ship needs a weapon. So we'll give this guy a field in which we can plug a weapon into. Now let me go ahead and draw a little box out right here. This box is where we would plug a weapon into. Now, again, the graphical drawing that I am doing on the whiteboard does not represent a visual thing that you're going to see in the game. What I'm trying to do is just demonstrate kind of an analogy with the actual type objects we're working with in visual form of how these things interrelate to one another. Okay? So it's not really so much of an analogy, it's just an interesting visual approach to what's going on. So if I was to say that we had a single shot weapon in here, well, here's a good way to do it. Let's say down here, let's draw those weapons again, and that was pretty horrible. So here's a single shot, automatic, and let me throw in the wave one. He was pretty cool looking, just to show the vast differences we could have. There we go. So if I was to take my single shot and plug him into this weapon, so now I have instantiated a single weapon, and I have linked him up in such a way that the ship, which will contain a weapon field, is now pointing to that guy. So we now have a weapon. That's good. But what does this weapon need? It needs some way for us to start and stop it. So on the ship itself, we're going to put some very simple functionality in place. We're going to put start fire and stop fire. Now, if you're thinking about, well, where do projectiles come in and all that good stuff, we'll get to it in just a minute, okay? I'm building my way up. So start fire and stop fire. So anytime any ship wants to fire a weapon, let's think about the player for a second. You hit the fire button. We're always going to call on that ship's start fire. The job of that ship's start fire is to check to make sure that we actually have a weapon. Because what if we didn't have a weapon for whatever reason? If we were to call upon that weapon to actually fire, we're going to have a problem because the weapon would be null because we don't have one, and everything would explode. And we don't want for that to happen. But we know that the true triggering of the functionality, being it spawn a projectile, damage everybody on the scene, that's handled from the weapon because the weapon handles the timing. That means that down here on our weapons, the weapon itself, and this will actually be defined in the weapon abstract class, and then as Logan was saying, functionality will be implemented in the very defined, very focused classes of weapon type. It's going to be a start fire and a stop fire, just as we've seen on the ship itself. And hang on one second, you'll see where I'm getting at. So start fire once again. So start fire and stop fire can be found on every weapon. Though start fire will be something that we're going to set up in such a way that we're going to form a contract between weapon, our base class, and all classes that extend from weapon. And by setting up this contract, by making start fire abstract, we will force any extending class to implement a start fire. And that makes sense. We want to know with complete confidence that anytime we call on a weapon to begin firing, it knows what to do. Stop fire will be made virtual. Stop fire is irrelevant to certain weapon types. If we have a single shot weapon, if you hold the fire button down, you will get a single shot, a single projectile. Nothing else will happen. When you let the fire button go, that's your stop fire. But with a single shot, what does that do? Nothing. With a fully automatic weapon, what does it do? Well, if I hold the fire button down, now I'm going to have projectiles coming out of my weapon at a particular rate. The moment I let the fire button go, the projectile stops. So you can see where with a fully automatic weapon, stop fire is important. But because it's not a requirement, we're not going to force all weapons to implement stop fire. All right? So why do we have start fire and stop fire on both our ship as well as every single weapon? Again, when you hit fire, our entry point is into that particular ship start fire. That guy is simply responsible for, on that ship, checking the weapon. Do we have a weapon? If we have a weapon, then let's go ahead and call on that weapon start fire. And then we're done. The weapon is now on its own. It can do its own thing. End of story. And stop fire, same thing. Okay, but we have to have a weapon in place. So that is a quick look at the weapon portion of the weapon system, but now let's introduce some projectiles so that we can understand how in the heck are we actually spawning some sort of visual evil thing that can collide with other ships and cause damage. These guys known as projectiles. Well, you've seen that we've set up two things. We've got a bullet and we've got a missile. So our bullets, these are our little plasma looking guys. So let's draw some sort of little plasma bullet. And let's draw some sort of cheap looking missile. So I believe you use something that looks kind of like this, Logan.
Yep, just a triangle with an angle on the bottom instead of a flat line. Very simple.
So these guys will be classes, as we've already seen. So we have node extending into game node, extending into projectile, extending from there into bullet and missile. So in these classes, we're going to have a static method that is responsible for actually shooting off a projectile, for instantiating a projectile, and we're going to send in a position on where it needs to be instantiated at, as well as a direction so that it knows which way it can go. But then at that point, these projectiles, as we know, are game nodes. So collisions taken care of. We can simply set a collision list on who these guys can collide with, such as I fire a weapon from my player ship. That weapon, that projectile, has its collision list set to enemies. Now, any enemy that it collides with will cause damage. But inside these classes, what we'll do is we'll simply create some static methods that will handle the instantiation of an actual projectile. So this is some functionality that's inside a method. So that's all this is. This is a little bit of code right here. Okay? Now, this is where things start to get really cool, as far as I'm concerned, with this particular system. Back on ship, everything that we're doing over here, that's all ship stuff. we're going to create a delegate. And this delegate's going to be called fire action. This means that since we're putting it on the ship, every single ship will have fire action. So let's go ahead and jot that down. Here we are with fire action, and once again, he's a delegate, meaning that we can encapsulate functionality into this guy. Well, again, for visual breakdown, let's go ahead and draw a box right here. This is our delegate on our ship. Every single ship has one, and it's the fire action. So if I was to take my plasma ball there, our bullet, and embed this functionality right here, encapsulate it in this delegate right here, then if I was to call on the ship's fire action, I would really be calling on this guy. Well, if I was calling on that guy, what did we say that static method's job was to do? It was to instantiate this guy at a particular position, going in a particular direction. And now we can go in and, with this projectile, make all sorts of settings in regards to how fast he travels, etc. But he's a game node. I mean, he's got a sprite sheet. He's got everything he needs now. So with the calling through fire action of this guy right here, we've spawned a projectile, we've sent him on his merry way, and we no longer need to concern ourselves with that. Hopefully at this point you're starting to see where these things are going to tie together. If on our weapon, if we were to make our weapon aware of the ship, so the ship is obviously aware of what weapon we're using, and the weapon was aware of the ship that it was with, then if we were to call on start fire, what's going to happen? We check to make sure that we have a weapon. We do. We have an instance of this single weapon. This single weapon is aware of the ship. So the single weapon, when we call upon its start fire, it can at any time it would like reach through to the ship and trigger fire action. So if he triggers fire action, then what have we just done? We've shot off a projectile. In this particular case, we've shot this guy off. But check it out. Again, what if we had a projectile that wasn't even a projectile? It was some sort of sonic pulse that came out. You didn't even see it. And the sonic pulse simply damaged every enemy on the scene. Well, again, it's just functionality. For doing that, we could replace fire action with that particular functionality. Then if we had this weapon right here, if we fire, that weapon reached in, triggered the functionality, he's really triggering this, now suddenly every enemy on the screen just took some damage. We didn't even see a projectile.
What's really cool about this setup is it makes the fire action completely external to the weapon itself. That means that there is nothing locked in stone about how the weapon itself works or what it can do. Because in the examples leading up till here, before the idea of something like a bomb or a weapon that damages everything, we've been talking projectiles more or less just because it gives a really easy thing to draw. When you say, all right, this weapon fires 3 things continuously, you can actually draw 3 tick marks and you see stuff. But the idea is that there is no projectile functionality locked into weapon. There is simply a callback to a fire action. And by that fire action, that means we can completely redefine a projectile spawning from the beginning, including the fact that it doesn't even have to be a projectile.
That's right. So let me add that in. I like how you put that. So these tick mark right here, these tick marks are really 2 things. They're just a fire pulse or a trigger pulse with a direction. Okay, so and the direction is important because of this. Now, of course, the direction is not a required thing because, as we've already seen, with a weapon like this, what's the direction? Well, the direction's irrelevant. Every enemy takes damage.
So you're given a direction, but you're free to disregard it. I'll also point out that with fire action, one thing that goes along with direction is position. If a weapon would like, it could suggest a position for the whatever it is to use.
But not required.
But once again, not required because the end use of that position and direction is just to be available for a series of instructions, a series of statements. Those statements may leverage them if they wish, or not.
Exactly. All right, so that is a look at how all of this ties together. Now, just another really quick example just to show you how interesting this is. Let's go back to saying that we are using our bullet, our plasma bullet, if you will, but our bullet, as the projectile that will get fired. And let's say that we're using our single shot right here, so we know that if we hit and hold the fire button, we a single hit to this guy occurs, which is going to spawn this guy, which is now flying around the screen. Watch this. Let's say we hit a power-up, and that power-up, all it needed to do was change out our weapon. So we've changed out our weapon to this. What happens when we hit fire now? Well, this is still what's getting hit. Okay, so this is getting triggered by this guy down here when we hit the fire button. But when we hit the fire button, now we have plasma balls going off in this particular type of pattern. Now, let's say we hit another power-up, and this other power-up just simply changed out our fire action so that we're now referencing new functionality for a new type of projectile. But we were still using this particular weapon. What happens? Well, a bunch of enemies are about to get really messed up because we're now going to be sending out a spread of seeking missiles like this right here. So you can see by decoupling the concept of timing and direction from projectiles, we have a tremendous amount of flexibility at our fingertips. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, it increases the flexibility in that now there are many more combinations of weapons than would be possible if you were hard-coding timing and direction and the projectile spawning action all into one class. Here, since we can write, as a matter of fact, looking just on the screen, you've got 3 different types of fire and 3 different projectiles. Now, technically, the wave isn't going to be too different on the remaining ones.
So we have 9 combinations of things that we can put together.
But exactly, that's what I was getting at, is that with only 6 classes written, and each 6 classes able to be very focused in and of themselves, then there's just automatically 9 different combinations in the ways that those can be put together. Not to mention the fact that, once again, each individual thing can be focused on. When you're working on the plasma ball and how it spawns, you don't have to worry about anything else. You don't even have to really worry too much about direction other than you're given a direction.
Yep.
Everything else can be very focused. Then later on, when you're working on direction, you're not worrying about, well, how do plasma balls look, or do they have a certain speed, or anything of that nature. You just think, okay, well, what's the timing and direction I want to use here?
So over the next handful of videos, we're going to create this system. But let's go ahead and spend just a minute, Logan, and reach a little further into the future and talk about how we're going to implement sidearms. That's something we decided to add into Space Fighter. We thought it would be a very nice addition for allowing our students to push their own version of Space Fighter even further. So what are attachments and where do they fit into the grand picture? And this really does bring us all the way back to the visual component that we discussed all the way back down here. So let's talk about that for just a second. And you gotta love Photoshop when it does that. So where exactly does the visual component fit in? Well, simple. We're going to make attachments be an extension to ship. Now you have to follow me for a second, and hopefully all of this will become very clear. So the way I'd like to do this is I'm just going to put a little connector in here, A. So who is A? Well, let's just come all the way down here somewhere. And so we'll say that this guy is attached into A, so A is pushing all the way through. So basically, this guy right here is really that. Okay, just so that everybody knows what I am thinking. We're going to call this attachments. I'll just put attach. It makes sense. If you think about a sidearm is something that is attached to your ship. Any sort of visual things that you happen to pick up as you're flying through power-ups or whatever it may be that begins connecting itself to the ship can be viewed as attachments. So from attachments, we shall create things. In Spacefighter, we're just going to create our sidearm, but you can create all sorts of interesting attachments. Let's say that we extended attachments into sidearms. And this sidearm is going to fire off plasma balls or missiles or whatever it is we'd like for it to fire off. So how does this look back on our other picture? Well, let me jump back over there real quick because this is where it all begins coming together nicely. Check this out. If I put attachments on, well, what is an attachment? An attachment is a ship. So if I had an attachment right here, an attachment right here, I'm just drawing these out as triangles because I think that represents the idea of ship nicely. What comes with every ship? A weapon and a delegate for our fire action. So here we are. We've just put on 2 sidearms. These sidearms could have any type of weapon associated. So let's pick on fully automatic here. So let's give it a fully automatic weapon that is firing missiles. There you go. It's that simple. All of that is in place. And since an attachment is a ship, is a game node, so it works its way on back up, it can collide. So now if we're flying along and we have this asteroid over here that's going down the screen, it can collide into one of our sidearms and destroy it. The sidearm can take damage. It can do all sorts of neat things. So we just automatically gain all of that functionality since we are extending from ship. So at first it might sound a little strange, but if you really think about it, it's not, because we can tell an attachment that it could be a weapon type of attachment by assigning a weapon and projectile functionality to it, or it might be an attachment that's just some sort of visual thing that seems to hinder you as you're flying along, because now you can take damage because of this thing that's made your ship larger, more bulky, but it has nothing to do with a weapon. So with the sidearms, we would turn around and assign a weapon and assign some sort of fire action to it, and now when you hit fire, as we get to the end of the Space Fighter video series, we're going to show you how, using our hierarchy, we can walk through, and this brings us all the way back to Perform, when Logan had created that earlier, and we had told you guys that we're going to get into Perform, and we're going to get into some recursion code, which will be a little separated from it. You'll see how all this ties together a little bit later. But we can start at the root level of our hierarchy. What is the root level? It's our ship. It's us. And we can walk all the way through it, firing each of the attachment's weapons. Because what's an attachment? A ship. Does a ship have a weapon? It can if it wants. So if we walk through all attachments in a hierarchy and say, start fire, if they have the ability to fire, they will. Logan, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just one thing to point out now, now that we've covered the visual side of weapons, saying that in the future when there are actual physical, visible weapons, that the idea is that those things descend from ship.
That's right.
So really, the ability for weapons to be attached to your ship goes back to just the idea of attaching more ships to your ship. Mm-hmm. And one interesting thing I want to point out there is you could almost look at the visual component of your weapon just is the ship. If you take sidearms out of the equation for a minute and just look at that first central ship.
Which I actually said that in this video back near the beginning.
If we were to say, okay, fine, technically in Space Fighter, our ship is our weapon.
That's
just
right.
By the way the game works is we fly the weapon around the screen and the ship can fire, so in that way it acts as a weapon. So if you look at it like that, as a matter of fact, you could even think of the ship class as an armed game node. Ship descends game node. And the key things that are going to be placed on ship are going to have to do with firing. Again, you even mentioned the fact that ship is going to have a start fire and stop fire method. So if you like, you could think of ship as an armed game node.
That's right. Very nice. And then, I just can't get across how much functionality how much flexibility is in place for any sort of desired functionality. We can even have this single shot right here. We can make this guy overheat if we wanted to. So our ship, at the very beginning, if we added that functionality into the weapon for single shot, then we could fire, and we could track, a buildup of heat. Then suddenly it stops firing. I mean, all of that is in place. And then any other sidearm that used this guy would overheat if we wanted it to. And since we've decoupled the concept of timing mechanisms from projectiles, we could use that single shot for our main ship and for the sidearms, but our main ship could shoot plasma balls and our sidearms could shoot missiles. They both could overheat, though, and causing a result of no plasmas or no missiles being fired out. That's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, with the exception of one more thing that I'm sure by now it's been hinted at, but I just want to make sure it's very clear. On weapon, we've talked about how it's going to have a start fire and a stop fire. We also have an offset. This is important. We need to know where on any ship, any attachment, sidearms, etc., which are ships, where we would like for our missile to appear at. We have already told you, missile, projectile, whatever it may be, we've already told you that all projectiles are going to be taking a look at a position and a direction. Doesn't have to use them, but it needs to take that information in. So basically, this functionality, will always take in those two informations, both of them at vector 2. That means the delegate needs to be set up in a way that it is going to require two vectors, one for position and one for direction. But the offset then is simply going to be used for saying this is where we will spawn our projection from. This is where we come up with our position at. So with our main ship, we would obviously not want to spawn from the center of the ship. We'd want to spawn, from somewhere up here. It would look like, it would just visually look right.
Exactly. Offset is the thing that allows us to look at our ship, because we're going to look at our ship's position as being the origin or the center of that ship, which would mean if we were to directly use a ship's position as the spawn location for the fire action, we would always spawn from the center of whatever ship we're attached to. If we provide an offset value inside of weapon, that means we can now, in essence, relocate the weapon to anywhere on the ship. If we want to stick it on the front of a ship for a player ship, maybe if we want to stick it to the bottom of the ship graphic, in the case that we're using an enemy-style ship, and the enemy is going the other direction.
That's right. So is there anything else you would like to add to this, Logan?
Nothing comes to mind. Again, this is just showing how weapon is tied to ship, how fire action is tied to ship, and how weapon interacts with fire action.
Fantastic. And how at the end, when we have attachments, which are just ships, which can have their own fire action as well as a weapon, basically we're going to recursively call through the entire hierarchy, firing off everybody that has a weapon. And with that, that is going to wrap up this quick overview, and let's start coding this system together. Thanks a lot, guys.